The Soprano line cut through the underground chaos of the Times Square station at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late March, a voice clear and powerful enough to make commuters slow their rushed trajectories between the 1 and the N trains. Amara Thompson sat in her wheelchair near the corridor connecting the platforms, her amplifier balanced on a milk crate beside her, her tip jar positioned where it would not be knocked over by the constant flow of human traffic. She was 19 years old, black, and had cerebral palsy that affected her mobility and gave her speech a rhythmic quality that some people struggled to understand, but that disappeared entirely when she sang. The song was an arrangement she had made herself, blending elements of Puccini with contemporary R&B in a way that should not have worked, but somehow did. Her voice moving between classical technique and soul phrasing with the kind of ease that comes from years of training and natural gift. She had been singing in the subway for 8 months, ever since she aged out of the foster care system, and discovered that the monthly disability payments she received were not sufficient to cover rent and food and the additional expenses that came with navigating New York City as a wheelchair user. The subway was not a choice she had made enthusiastically. Street performance carried stigma, was seen by many people as a last resort for failed musicians, or as a form of begging dressed up with artistic pretense. But it was also one of the few performance opportunities available to someone like Amara, who had applied to dozens of clubs and venues and music programs and had been told repeatedly that while her voice was impressive, the logistics of accommodating a wheelchair performer were too complicated, the insurance liability too significant, the audience expectations too fixed around able-bodied presentation. So she sang in the subway, in the corridors where the acoustics were decent and the foot traffic was heavy, and she earned enough on good days to supplement her disability payments and pay rent on the single room she rented in a shared apartment in the South Bronx. The work was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with the singing itself. The physical effort of getting herself and her equipment down into the subway system each day, navigating platforms that were often not accessible, dealing with elevators that were frequently broken, asking strangers for help lifting her wheelchair up or down stairs when necessary, all while maintaining the cheerful performance demeanor that busking required. But the singing itself, that was pure, was the thing that made everything else tolerable. When Amara sang, she was not the disabled girl that people stared at or pitied or ignored. She was a voice, a presence, something that commanded attention through beauty rather than through spectacle. People stopped and listened, dropped bills into her tip jar, sometimes stayed for multiple songs. Some recorded her on their phones, brief clips to share with friends or to post on social media with captions about hidden talent in unexpected places. One of those recordings, captured by a woman named Jennifer Wu, who was running late for a meeting but who paused anyway because the voice was too extraordinary to ignore, would change everything. Jennifer recorded 90 seconds of Amara performing her Puccini R&B fusion, captured not just the voice, but the way commuters stopped and gathered, the visible emotion on people's faces, the contrast between the ordinary subway setting and the extraordinary performance happening within it. She posted the video to TikTok at 7:23 p.m. that evening, with the caption, "This voice stopped me in my tracks at Times Square. Who is she?" The video reached 1,000 views by midnight, 10,000 by the following morning, 50,000 by noon, and then the algorithm found it, the mysterious machinery of viral content that elevated certain posts above others, and by Thursday evening the video had been viewed 6 million times and was still climbing. Amara knew none of this initially. She did not have TikTok, had limited social media presence because maintaining online profiles required data plans and devices that were outside her budget. She knew something had changed when she arrived at her usual spot in Times Square on Thursday afternoon and found several people waiting with their phones out, recording her setup, asking if she was the singer from the viral video. She was confused at first, uncertain what video they were referring to, but one of them showed her Jennifer's post on their phone, and Amara watched herself singing, watched the view count ticking upward in real time, watched the thousands of comments scrolling past. The comments were a mixture of praise and pity, celebration and condescension. Many people focused on her voice, describing it as angelic or stunning or breathtaking. But just as many focused on her disability, describing her as inspirational or brave, projecting narratives of overcoming and triumph that had little to do with Amara's actual experience. Some comments were straightforwardly ableist, expressing surprise that someone in a wheelchair could sing so well, as if disability and artistic talent were mutually exclusive. Others were performatively supportive in ways that felt objectifying, treating Amara as a symbol of resilience rather than as an actual person with complexity and agency. If you are reading this account and recognizing something familiar in the dynamics of how Amara's talent was received, in the ways that disabled black women are simultaneously celebrated and diminished, held up as inspiration while being denied full humanity and autonomy, consider the importance of ensuring that stories like this circulate beyond the viral moments that flatten them into simple narratives. The work of actually understanding requires more than watching a 90-second clip. The viral video brought immediate consequences. By Friday, Amara had been contacted by 3 talent managers, 2 record label representatives, a reality TV casting director, and a journalist from the New York Times who wanted to write a profile. The messages came through various channels, people finding her through the tip jar Venmo handle that was visible in the video, through inquiries to the Subway performer community, through direct approaches while she was performing. Everyone wanted something, wanted access to her story or her voice or her image, wanted to be the person who discovered her or represented her or told her story to the world. Amara was overwhelmed and uncertain how to navigate these approaches. She had no manager, no lawyer, no professional representation or guidance. She had grown up in foster care, had aged out of the system without family support or mentors, had learned to be wary of people offering help, because help often came with strings attached or with expectations she could not meet. But she also understood that this was an opportunity, that viral attention was fleeting, and that if she did not capitalize on it quickly, the moment would pass, and she would return to being an anonymous Subway performer, earning $30 on a good day. She met with the talent managers first. 3 separate conversations in coffee shops near Times Square where they pitched their visions for her career. The first manager, a white man in his 40s named David Sterling, talked about crossover appeal and building her brand and positioning her as the next viral success story. He used phrases like authentic narrative and compelling journey, and told her that her disability would be a major selling point, that audiences loved stories of overcoming adversity, that she could be an inspiration to millions. The second manager, a black woman in her 30s named Nicole Patterson, was more direct about the challenges. She told Amara that the music industry was not designed for disabled performers, that venues lacked accessibility, that touring was structured around logistics that assumed able-bodied artists, that record labels would want her voice but would struggle with how to market a wheelchair-using singer. Nicole was honest about the fact that representation would require fighting constantly, advocating for accommodations, challenging assumptions, and that even with all that effort, success was not guaranteed. The third manager, a younger white woman named Kelly Chen, positioned herself as a social media expert who could leverage the viral moment into a sustainable online presence and income stream through streaming platforms and brand partnerships. She talked about TikTok strategies and Instagram aesthetics and YouTube monetization, about building a following that could support Amara financially without requiring her to navigate the traditional music industry infrastructure. Amara listened to all 3 pitches and felt the weight of decisions she was not equipped to make. Each manager offered a different vision of what her career could look like, and each vision had appeal and limitations. David's traditional industry approach might get her signed to a label, but would likely require her to conform to narratives she found uncomfortable. Nicole's honest assessment of barriers was refreshing but also daunting. Kelly's social media focus felt more sustainable but potentially limiting in terms of artistic development. She asked for time to think, collected the business cards and contact information, and went back to performing in the subway because she still needed to pay rent, and the viral video had not yet translated into actual income. But now, when she performed, there were always people recording her, posting new videos, commenting on her technique or her disability or her story. She had become a character in other people's narratives, a symbol of something larger than herself, and she was not certain how to reclaim agency in a situation where so much attention was focused on her, but so little of it was actually about understanding who she was. The New York Times profile ran 2 weeks after the initial video went viral, a feature in the Metro section with the headline, "The Subway Singer Whose Voice Stopped the City." The article was well-intentioned and generally respectful, describing Amara's talent and her circumstances and the barriers she faced as a disabled performer. But it also deployed many of the tropes that disabled people found exhausting, describing her as brave and inspirational, emphasizing her resilience in the face of adversity, positioning her disability as something she was overcoming rather than as a neutral fact of her embodiment. The article included quotes from Amara about her foster care background, about aging out of the system, about the economic precarity of trying to survive on disability payments in New York City. It described her cerebral palsy in clinical terms, explained the logistics of subway performing, and included responses from music industry professionals speculating about whether she could have a viable career, given the accessibility challenges in the industry. What the article did not include was Amara's critique of why those accessibility challenges existed, her analysis of how the music industry systematically excluded disabled performers, her frustration with being treated as inspirational rather than as an artist deserving of evaluation on the quality of her work. The journalist had asked about these topics, but the published version of the article had edited out most of her more pointed commentary, leaving the safer narrative of talented young woman facing challenges with grace and determination. The article brought another surge of attention, this time from more established industry figures. A booking agent reached out about possible performance opportunities at accessible venues. A producer from a morning talk show invited her to appear as a guest. A disability rights organization asked if she would speak at their annual fundraising gala, and several musicians whose work Amara admired sent messages of support and offers to collaborate, recognizing in her a talent that deserved better opportunities than subway busking. One of those musicians was a singer-songwriter named Marcus Reed, a black man in his early 30s who had achieved moderate success in the R&B world and who had been following Amara's story with interest. Marcus reached out directly through Instagram, where Amara had finally created an account to manage the flood of attention, and his message was different from the others she had received. He did not offer to help or to mentor or to provide opportunities. He simply said that he respected her artistry, that he understood some of the challenges she was facing from his own experience navigating the industry as a black artist, and that if she ever wanted to talk or collaborate without agenda or pressure, she should reach out. Amara responded cautiously, wary of anyone offering connection without clearly stated expectations, but also curious about what collaboration might look like with someone who seemed to approach her as peer rather than as charity case or inspiration. They met for coffee in Harlem, and Marcus was direct about his interest. He was working on an album that explored themes of access and exclusion, and he thought Amara's voice and perspective would add something essential to the project. He was also honest that his own platform was modest, that he was not a major star who could guarantee her exposure, but that he could offer a professional recording session and fair compensation and creative partnership that respected her as artist rather than as symbol. It was the first offer Amara had received that felt genuinely collaborative rather than extractive, and she agreed to the session. They recorded 3 tracks over 2 weeks in a studio in Brooklyn, and the experience was revelatory for Amara. The studio was fully accessible. Marcus had ensured that before booking it. The producer and engineer treated her as a professional collaborator, asking about her artistic choices and technical preferences rather than focusing on her disability. And the music they created together was complex and challenging and beautiful in ways that the subway performances, constrained by time and acoustics and audience attention spans, could never be. But the recording session also crystallized for Amara how much she had been missing, how much her subway performing was a compromise forced by systemic barriers rather than an actual choice. She had the vocal training and the artistic vision to work at a much higher level, but access to studios and collaborators and audiences required resources and connections and institutional support that were unavailable to disabled performers who had aged out of foster care and who survived on disability payments. The conversation about compensation for the recording session revealed another dimension of the challenge. Marcus offered her $1,000 per track, which seemed generous, until Amara calculated that it was significantly less than union scale for professional session work, less than he was paying the other musicians on the album, justified by the fact that this was as much about giving her exposure and experience as it was about her actual contribution. Marcus was apologetic when Amara pointed out the disparity, acknowledged that she was right, and adjusted the payment to match what others were receiving. But the initial offer had revealed the casual assumption that disabled artists should be grateful for opportunities rather than fairly compensated for their work. These patterns, these dynamics where disabled artists are offered exposure instead of pay, where their inclusion is framed as generosity rather than as recognition of their merit, where even well-intentioned collaborators unconsciously replicate the structural devaluation that makes sustainable artistic careers nearly impossible for disabled people. These patterns deserve recognition and interrogation. If you have followed Amara's story this far, consider sharing it with others who need to understand that visibility is not the same as equity, that representation without resources is insufficient, that genuine inclusion requires material investment. The tracks Amara recorded with Marcus were released as singles over the following 2 months, and they received critical attention from music blogs and streaming playlists that focused on emerging R&B artists. The response was positive, with reviewers praising the vocal interplay between Marcus and Amara and noting her distinctive sound that blended classical training with contemporary sensibility. Several reviews mentioned her disability, usually in the opening paragraph as context, sometimes with the kind of inspiration framing that Amara found frustrating but had learned to expect. The streaming numbers were modest, tens of thousands of plays rather than millions, but they represented actual artistic validation rather than viral attention based on spectacle. People were listening to the music itself, evaluating it on its merits, and generally concluding that Amara was a serious talent, deserving of wider recognition. The question was how to translate that recognition into sustainable career opportunities when the infrastructure of the music industry remained fundamentally inaccessible. Amara continued performing in the subway while navigating these questions, needing the income but also finding that her relationship to the work had changed. The viral video had made her recognizable, which meant that people approached her constantly, asking for photos or videos, treating her performances as celebrity encounters rather than as busking. Some people were generous, tipping substantially because they had seen her story and wanted to support her. Others were extractive, recording her without permission, posting content that generated engagement for them without compensating her, commodifying her image and her voice without consent. The disability rights organization that had invited her to speak at their gala followed up with a formal invitation and an offer of $500 for a 20-minute speech about her experience as a disabled artist. Amara was uncertain about accepting, uncomfortable with being positioned as spokesperson for disabled artists, generally when her experience was specific to her particular circumstances and identities. But $500 was significant money, more than she typically earned in a week of Subway performances, and the gala would provide networking opportunities that might lead to other possibilities. She accepted the invitation and spent several weeks preparing her remarks, trying to articulate something authentic about her experience that went beyond the inspiration narratives she had been resisting. She wanted to talk about systemic barriers, about how the music industry's inaccessibility was a choice rather than an inevitability, about how disabled artists were denied opportunities and then blamed for their lack of success. But she also knew that the gala audience would be primarily wealthy donors who wanted to feel good about their support for disability rights, who might not respond well to critique that implicated them in the very systems they claimed to oppose. The gala was held at a hotel ballroom in Midtown, and Amara arrived early to ensure that the accessibility arrangements were adequate. The venue was technically ADA compliant, but compliance was not the same as actual usability, and Amara discovered that the accessible entrance was around the back of the building through a service corridor, that the accessible restroom was on a different floor, requiring a specific elevator, that the stage where she would speak had a ramp that was steep enough to be difficult to navigate independently. These details mattered because they revealed how much accessibility was treated as an afterthought, a legal requirement grudgingly met rather than a priority integrated into planning. Amara negotiated adjustments with the venue staff, who were polite but clearly annoyed by her requests, and by the time the gala began, she was exhausted in ways that the able-bodied speakers would never experience. Her speech focused on the gap between representation and resources, between visibility and actual support, between society's fascination with disabled achievement and its unwillingness to remove the barriers that made achievement unnecessarily difficult. She talked about the Subway performing, about the recording session with Marcus, about the offers she had received that treated her as inspiration rather than as professional. And she challenged the audience directly, asking them to consider whether their support for disability rights extended to actually paying disabled artists fairly, to demanding venue accessibility, to using their influence to change industry practices rather than just celebrating individual disabled people who succeeded despite systemic barriers. The response was complicated. Some audience members gave her a standing ovation, clearly moved by her directness. Others applauded politely, but with visible discomfort, apparently not expecting to be challenged at an event they had attended expecting to feel charitable and generous. And several people approached her afterward with defensive comments about how much progress had been made, how much harder things used to be, how grateful she should be for the opportunities she was receiving. But the speech also led to meaningful connections. A music producer named Lisa Hernandez, a Latina woman who ran an independent label focused on artists from marginalized communities, asked to meet with Amara about potentially signing her. A disability advocate named Thomas Benson, a white man who used a mobility scooter and who worked on accessibility policy, offered to connect her with resources and legal support for negotiating contracts. and several disabled artists reached out to express appreciation for her willingness to speak honestly about systemic barriers rather than performing the gratitude and resilience that disabled people were constantly expected to display. Lisa Hernandez's label, called Elevation Records, was small but respected within independent music circles. Lisa had built the label specifically to work with artists who were excluded or exploited by major labels, and she had developed relationships with accessible venues and with producers who understood how to work collaboratively with disabled artists. She was honest with Amara that signing to Elevation would not make her famous or wealthy, that independent labels operated on tight margins, and that success was measured in sustainability rather than in stardom. But she was also honest that she believed in Amara's talent and that she wanted to create conditions where that talent could develop without being constrained by inaccessibility or filtered through inspiration narratives. Amara met with Lisa several times over the following weeks, discussing what a recording contract might look like, what artistic direction felt authentic, what support she would need to actually record and release and promote an album. Lisa's approach was collaborative rather than prescriptive, asking Amara what she wanted to create rather than telling her what would sell, acknowledging that commercial viability mattered, but that artistic integrity was equally important. The contract Lisa offered was straightforward, a standard independent label agreement with reasonable terms and without the exploitative clauses that characterized many major label deals. Amara would retain ownership of her compositions, would receive 50% of streaming and sales revenue, would have creative control over her recordings, and would have the support of Elevation's small team for production and promotion. The advance was modest, $10,000 against future earnings, but it was real money that would allow Amara to reduce her subway performing and focus more fully on recording. Before signing, Amara consulted with Thomas Benson, the disability advocate who had offered support. Thomas reviewed the contract and confirmed that the terms were fair, that there were no obvious red flags, that Lisa's reputation in the industry was solid. But he also cautioned Amara that even well-intentioned labels could fail to follow through on accessibility commitments, that she should document everything in writing, that she should be prepared to advocate constantly for the accommodations she needed. Amara signed the contract in July, 4 months after the initial viral video, and the advance payment allowed her to finally stop performing in the subway. The relief was enormous, not just the physical relief of not having to navigate the inaccessible subway system daily, but the emotional relief of not having to perform constantly for strangers, of not being treated as spectacle or inspiration, of being able to focus on developing her artistry rather than on survival. The recording process for her debut album took 6 months, working with producers and musicians that Lisa connected her with, all of whom had been briefed about accessibility and about treating Amara as professional collaborator rather than as charitable project. The sessions were held in a studio in Queens that had been specifically designed with accessibility in mind, with wide doorways and adjustable equipment and accessible restrooms, and a culture that normalized disability rather than treating it as exceptional. Amara recorded 12 tracks for the album, a mixture of original compositions and reimagined covers that showcased her range and her distinctive approach to blending classical and contemporary styles. The process was collaborative and creatively fulfilling, in ways that the subway performing had never been, allowing her to take risks and experiment and develop ideas across multiple takes rather than having to deliver perfect performances under time pressure. But the process also revealed new challenges. Some of the musicians she worked with had never collaborated with a disabled artist before and were uncertain how to communicate, either treating her with excessive delicacy or making assumptions about what she could or could not do. Some of the producers had aesthetic preferences that conflicted with Amara's vision, and navigating those conflicts required assertiveness that was sometimes interpreted as being difficult or demanding, when similar assertiveness from able-bodied artists was read as having strong artistic vision. And the cerebral palsy itself created challenges in the studio, not with the singing, but with the physical demands of multiple-hour recording sessions, with fatigue that accumulated differently than it did for able-bodied performers, with the need for breaks and accommodations that disrupted the typical studio flow. Lisa and the production team were accommodating, adjusting schedules and workflows to meet Amara's needs, but Amara was always aware that she was requiring special consideration, that her body's limitations were creating inefficiencies that cost time and money. These realities, these daily navigations of disability in professional environments designed around able-bodied norms, are part of what makes sustainable careers so difficult for disabled artists. The constant need to advocate, to explain, to justify accommodations, to prove that you are worth the additional effort, this emotional and cognitive labor is exhausting and often invisible to able-bodied colleagues and audiences who see only the finished product. Understanding this context is essential for anyone who wants to move beyond surface-level appreciation of disabled artists' work toward actual solidarity and structural change. The album, titled Elevation, was released in January, 10 months after the viral video. Elevation Records coordinated with music blogs and streaming playlists and disability media outlets to promote the release, positioning Amara as an emerging artist with a distinctive sound, rather than primarily as a disabled singer. The promotional materials mentioned her disability factually, acknowledging it as part of her identity without making it the central narrative, and emphasized her artistic vision and vocal technique and the quality of the recordings. The reception was positive within the independent music community, with reviews praising her voice and her songwriting and her ability to bridge classical and contemporary traditions. Several reviewers compared her to other crossover artists, noting that her approach was more sophisticated than most attempts to blend genres. The album streamed moderately, not a breakout success but respectable numbers for an independent release by an unknown artist, and it generated enough revenue that Amara's 50% share, combined with her disability payments, allowed her to live more comfortably than she had since aging out of foster care. But the album's success also brought renewed media attention, and with it the return of inspiration narratives that Amara had been trying to resist. Several outlets wanted to interview her, but their interest was clearly more about her disability than about her music. Their questions focused on overcoming adversity and being an inspiration rather than on her artistic process or her influences or her future plans. Amara declined most of these interviews, selective about which media appearances would actually serve her artistic career rather than just commodifying her disability. One interview she did accept was with a podcast called Disability Voices, which focused specifically on disability culture and politics and which approached her as a disabled artist rather than as an inspirational figure. The conversation was wide-ranging, covering her experience in foster care, her subway performing, her navigation of the music industry, her thoughts on accessibility and representation, and her critiques of how disabled artists were systematically undervalued. The interview was honest about challenges without being depressing, critical of systems without being bitter, and it resonated with disabled listeners who appreciated hearing their experiences validated. But it also generated backlash from some able-bodied listeners who accused Amara of being ungrateful, of complaining despite her success, of not appreciating how much progress had been made in disability rights. The backlash was exhausting, required Amara to engage in public education about ableism and systemic barriers, demanded emotional labor that took time and energy away from her actual artistic work. Lisa Hernandez, watching these dynamics unfold, suggested that Amara consider hiring a publicist who could manage media relations and filter interview requests and help shape public narrative in ways that served Amara's goals rather than just feeding the viral content cycle. Lisa connected her with a publicist named Jordan Ellis, a non-binary person with chronic illness who understood disability politics and who specialized in working with marginalized artists. Jordan's approach was strategic, declining most interview requests and accepting only those that would position Amara as serious artist rather than as inspiration, negotiating agreements with media outlets about which topics were off-limits, coaching Amara on how to redirect conversations when interviewers veered into ableist framing. The relationship was professional and effective, reducing Amara's stress and allowing her to focus more on music and less on public relations. But hiring Jordan required paying a monthly retainer that consumed a significant portion of Amara's income, revealing the challenge that all independent artists faced of needing professional support to manage careers but having limited resources to pay for that support. Amara was more financially stable than she had been performing in the subway, but she was still far from prosperous, still making calculations about which expenses were essential and which were luxuries she could not afford. The spring after her album release brought performance opportunities that crystallized both the progress Amara had made and the limitations that remained. She was invited to perform at a music festival in Austin focused on emerging artists, a showcase that would expose her to industry professionals and potentially lead to larger opportunities. But when she inquired about accessibility, she discovered that the festival had no accessible transportation between stages, that the artist hospitality area was up a flight of stairs, that her performance slot would require her to use a temporary ramp that had not been tested with a wheelchair user. Amara raised these concerns with the festival organizers, who responded with a mixture of defensiveness and promises to make adjustments. But the adjustments were minimal, the accommodations were grudging, and it became clear that the festival had not seriously considered accessibility in their planning and was now scrambling to comply with legal requirements without actually creating inclusive conditions. Amara withdrew from the festival, posting a public statement about the inadequate accessibility and about how disabled artists were constantly expected to accept substandard conditions or to forfeit opportunities. The statement generated substantial attention, with disability advocates praising her refusal to accept inaccessibility and with festival organizers issuing defensive responses about how hard they had tried to accommodate her needs. But the attention also led to backlash from some music industry professionals who suggested that she was being difficult, that she was hurting her own career by publicly criticizing venues, that she needed to be more flexible if she wanted to succeed in a competitive industry. The backlash revealed something essential about how the music industry treated disabled artists, which was that they were welcome only if they accommodated themselves to existing structures, only if they accepted inadequate accessibility without complaint, only if they performed gratitude for whatever minimal inclusion was offered. Artists who advocated for actual accessibility, who demanded equal treatment rather than special favors, who refused to accept discrimination quietly, these artists were labeled as difficult and were excluded from opportunities as punishment for their advocacy. Amara watched her career opportunities narrow in the weeks after the Austin Festival withdrawal, venues that had expressed interest suddenly becoming unavailable, booking agents who had been enthusiastic suddenly becoming non-responsive. The message was clear. Disabled artists who insisted on accessibility would be shut out of industry opportunities, regardless of their talent or their commercial potential. But the statement also connected Amara with other disabled artists who had experienced similar treatment, who had been excluded from festivals and venues and industry opportunities because accessibility was treated as an impossible burden rather than as a basic requirement. A network began forming, facilitated through social media and through disability arts organizations, of disabled musicians and performers sharing information about which venues were actually accessible, which booking agents understood disability issues, which industry professionals were trustworthy, and which would exploit or exclude disabled artists. This network became Amara's primary professional community, more supportive and more useful than the mainstream music industry connections that had proven so unreliable. Through the network, she learned about accessible venues in various cities, connected with disabled artists who were interested in collaboration, discovered resources for legal advocacy when venues violated accessibility requirements, and found solidarity with people who understood the particular challenges of navigating the music industry as a disabled person. One of the people she connected with through the network was a disabled booking agent named Patricia Morrison, a black woman who used a power wheelchair and who had spent 15 years working in the music industry before starting her own agency focused specifically on disabled and marginalized artists. Patricia understood the barriers intimately, had experienced them herself throughout her career, and had built her agency specifically to create alternatives to the mainstream industry structures that systematically excluded disabled artists. Patricia offered to represent Amara, and the conversation about what representation would look like was refreshingly direct. Patricia was honest that her agency was small, that her roster of artists was not famous, that the venues she worked with were not prestigious or high-paying. But she was also honest that every artist she represented actually performed, that accessibility was guaranteed rather than negotiated, that artists were paid fairly rather than being offered exposure, and that advocacy for disabled artists was central to her business model rather than being a side consideration. Amara signed with Patricia's agency, and over the following year, she performed at dozens of venues across the Northeast and Midwest, small clubs and community centers and art spaces that were either accessible by design or that worked with Patricia to ensure accessibility. The performances were not glamorous, did not generate viral attention or major media coverage, but they were professional and meaningful and sustainable in ways that the subway performing had never been. The audiences at these venues were different from the subway crowds, smaller but more attentive, often including significant numbers of disabled people who rarely attended mainstream music venues because of accessibility barriers. Performing for these audiences felt different to Amara, felt like her artistry was being received by people who understood the context of her work, who appreciated both her vocal talent and her existence as a disabled black woman creating space for herself in an industry that had not made space for her. 2 years after the viral video, Amara had achieved a version of success that looked nothing like what the initial viral attention had suggested might be possible. She had not been signed to a major label, had not had a breakout hit, had not become famous or wealthy, but she was supporting herself as a working musician, recording and releasing music through Elevation Records, performing regularly at accessible venues, collaborating with other disabled artists, and building a career that was sustainable and artistically fulfilling. The mainstream music industry remained largely inaccessible to her, and she had stopped trying to force her way into spaces that did not want to accommodate her. Instead, she focused on building alternative infrastructure, on creating the conditions for success, rather than waiting for existing institutions to change. It was harder work in many ways, required constant hustle and advocacy and community building, but it was also more aligned with her values and more respectful of her autonomy. She returned to Times Square subway station occasionally, not to perform, but to observe, watching other buskers occupy the space where she had spent so many hours singing for commuters who mostly rushed past. The viral video that had originated in that corridor was still circulating online, had been viewed millions of times, was still generating comments about inspiration and overcoming and hidden talent. But the video felt disconnected from her current reality, felt like it was about a different person or a different time, a moment that had catalyzed change, but that no longer defined her. The question of what the viral video had actually changed was complex. It had given Amara visibility that led to opportunities she would not otherwise have had, connections that enabled her current career. But it had also created expectations and narratives that were difficult to escape, had positioned her as inspiration rather than as artist, had generated attention that was often more about spectacle than about genuine appreciation for her work. The viral moment had been necessary but not sufficient, had opened doors, but had not removed the barriers that made walking through those doors so difficult. If you have followed Amara Thompson's journey from subway performer to independent recording artist, from viral sensation to working musician building sustainable career outside mainstream institutions, consider what her story illuminates about how visibility operates differently than equity, how representation without resources is insufficient, how genuine inclusion requires structural change rather than individual accommodation. Consider sharing this account with others who need to understand that disabled artists deserve not just appreciation, but actual support, not just inspiration narratives, but fair compensation and accessible opportunities. Amara continued recording music, releasing her second album 3 years after the first, a more experimental project that incorporated elements of jazz and electronic music into her classical contemporary blend. The album received less attention than her debut, did not generate viral moments or media coverage, but it represented artistic growth and creative risk-taking that she had not been able to pursue while focused on survival and subway performing. She also began teaching, working with disabled youth through a program run by a disability arts organization, helping young people develop their artistic voices and navigate the challenges of pursuing creative careers while disabled. The teaching was fulfilling in ways that performing was not, allowed her to contribute to building the infrastructure and community support that she had lacked when she was younger, created pathways for the next generation that might be slightly less difficult than the path she had traveled. The teaching income supplemented her performance and recording income, creating greater financial stability and allowing her to make choices based on artistic merit rather than purely on economic necessity. She was not wealthy, would probably never be wealthy given the systemic barriers that prevented most disabled artists from achieving commercial success. But she was surviving and creating and contributing to her community, and that felt like success measured against what had seemed possible when she was performing in the subway for $30 a day. Lisa Hernandez's Elevation Records grew slowly over the years following Amara's debut, signing additional artists from marginalized communities and building reputation as a label that treated artists fairly and prioritized accessibility and social justice values. Lisa offered Amara a position on the label's advisory board, asking her to help evaluate potential signings and to provide perspective on accessibility and disability inclusion. The position was unpaid, but gave Amara influence over the label's direction and allowed her to advocate for other disabled artists who were seeking opportunities. Through this work, Amara became increasingly involved in disability arts advocacy more broadly, speaking at conferences and participating in policy discussions and writing about the barriers disabled artists faced in various creative industries. The advocacy work was time-consuming and often frustrating, involved endless conversations with people who needed basic education about ableism and accessibility, required emotional labor that was rarely compensated. But it also felt necessary, felt like the only way to create conditions where disabled artists might have slightly easier paths than the one she had navigated. 5 years after the viral video, Amara participated in a panel discussion at a disability rights conference, talking about her experience as a disabled musician and about the systemic changes needed in the music industry. Also on the panel were Patricia Morrison, her booking agent, and 2 other disabled musicians who had built careers outside mainstream industry structures. The conversation was wide-ranging and honest, covering topics from accessibility requirements to inspiration narratives to the economic precarity that characterized most disabled artists' lives. During the Q&A session, a young disabled woman in the audience asked whether the panelists thought things were getting better, whether the increased visibility of disabled artists meant that actual conditions were improving. The question hung in the air for a moment, and Amara looked at her fellow panelists before responding. "Things are different," Amara said carefully. "There's more representation, more visibility, more conversation about disability in creative fields. But I'm not sure that translates into things being materially better for most disabled artists. The economic barriers remain, the accessibility challenges remain, the inspiration narratives remain. What's changed is that there are now more of us refusing to accept those conditions quietly, building alternative infrastructure, supporting each other, advocating for structural change. That's not nothing, but it's also not enough." Patricia added, "The question assumes that progress is linear, that increased visibility automatically leads to better conditions. But often what happens is that visibility makes the barriers more obvious, without actually removing them. Disabled artists become more visible, but the industry structures that exclude us remain largely unchanged. So yes, some things are better. More disabled artists are creating work, finding audiences, building careers. But most of us are still doing it despite the system, rather than because the system has changed to include us." Dadisine, the other panelists agreed, and the conversation shifted to discussing what actual structural change would require, what demands disabled artists should be making of venues and labels and festivals and funding organizations. The conversation was energizing but also sobering, revealing how much work remained, how many barriers persisted, how difficult transformation was even with growing awareness and advocacy. After the panel, several young disabled artists approached Amara to thank her for her honesty, for not sugarcoating the challenges, for acknowledging that success required both talent and luck and relentless advocacy. Some of them shared their own stories of rejection and exclusion, of venues that would not accommodate them, of industry professionals who treated them as charity cases rather than as artists. And some of them asked for advice, for guidance about how to navigate the barriers they were facing. Amara gave what advice she could, connected people with resources and contacts, emphasized the importance of community and mutual support among disabled artists. But she was also honest that she did not have all the answers, that her own path had been contingent and unreplicable, that what had worked for her might not work for others, with different disabilities or different circumstances or different artistic goals. She thought about that first viral video often, about how it had changed her life in ways both profound and limited, about how the 90 seconds Jennifer Wu had recorded in Times Square Station had created opportunities, but had also created expectations and narratives that she was still working to complicate and resist. The video had made her visible, but visibility had turned out to be much more complicated than the initial viral moment suggested, had brought both opportunities and objectification, had opened some doors while revealing how many others remained closed. Amara was 30 years old now, more than a decade removed from aging out of foster care, 6 years past the subway performing that had consumed her late teens and early 20s. She had built a life that felt stable and meaningful, had created a career that allowed her to support herself while making music that felt authentic to her artistic vision. She had found community among other disabled artists, had developed skills in advocacy and organizing, had become someone that younger disabled artists looked to for guidance. But she also lived with the ongoing awareness that her career existed in the margins, that mainstream success remained largely inaccessible regardless of her talent or her work ethic, that the music industry's systemic ableism meant that disabled artists would always be fighting for recognition and resources that able-bodied artists received automatically. The fight was exhausting, required constant vigilance and advocacy, demanded emotional and cognitive labor that took energy away from actual artistic creation. Sometimes Amara wondered what her life might have looked like if the subway video had never gone viral, if she had remained anonymous and had continued busking indefinitely or had found some other survival strategy. Would she have eventually connected with Lisa Hernandez and Elevation Records through different pathways? Would she have found the disabled artist community and the advocacy work that now defined much of her life? Or would she still be performing in subway stations, unrecognized and economically precarious, her talent appreciated by passing commuters, but never developed into sustainable career? The questions were unanswerable, but they revealed something about how contingent success was, how much it depended on factors beyond individual talent or effort, how the difference between obscurity and modest recognition often came down to algorithmic chance and viral moments, rather than to merit or artistic quality. Amara had been talented before the viral video and remained talented after, but the video had created visibility that enabled opportunities, and without that visibility, those opportunities would likely have remained inaccessible regardless of her capabilities. She continued making music, releasing albums through Elevation Records every 2 or 3 years, each one representing artistic evolution and creative risk-taking. She continued performing, building relationships with accessible venues and with audiences who appreciated her work. She continued teaching and advocating, contributing to the slow work of building infrastructure and community support for disabled artists. And she continued living her life, navigating the daily realities of disability in a world designed for able-bodied people, finding joy and meaning and connection despite the barriers and the exhaustion and the ongoing struggle. The story that had begun with 90 seconds of video recorded in a subway station had expanded into years of artistic development and community building and advocacy work, had transformed from viral moment into sustainable career, had evolved from individual visibility into collective organizing. It was not the story that the viral video had suggested, not the narrative of sudden fame and mainstream success, but it was real and meaningful and worth telling because it illuminated truths about disability and artistry and systemic barriers that simple inspiration narratives obscured. And it was a story that continued unfolding, that had no neat conclusion, that existed in the ongoing present tense of Amara's life and work and advocacy. The viral video had been a catalyst, but not a resolution, had opened possibilities without guaranteeing outcomes, had created visibility without creating equity. What happened next depended on many factors: on Amara's continued persistence and creativity, on the disabled artist community's collective organizing, on whether able-bodied people and institutions chose to address ableism seriously rather than just celebrating individual disabled artists as inspirations. The work continued. The advocacy continued. The music continued. And Amara Thompson, who had started performing in subway stations out of economic necessity, and who had built a career through a combination of talent and viral attention and community support and relentless advocacy, continued creating and organizing and teaching and living, continued being more than the inspiration narrative that the viral video had imposed on her, continued insisting that disabled artists deserved not just visibility but resources, not just appreciation, but equity, not just individual accommodation, but systemic change. That was the real story, the one that extended beyond viral moments and media profiles, the one that required sustained attention and genuine solidarity, the one that would continue unfolding long after the initial video had been forgotten by everyone, except those who understood that visibility alone had never been the goal.